So today we are very, very fortunate to have Caroline Pham, who's a commissioner at the Commodities Future Trading Commission in the United States. And we are going to talk to her about a whole range of issues, and interestingly, about regulation both in the U.S. and abroad. We're going to talk to her a little bit about her international travels and discussions. And I want to just give you a little bit of background on Caroline. So she was nominated by President Biden to be a commissioner and confirmed by the Senate and sworn in on April 14th, 2022. It is no surprise that he chose her because she has a deep background in regulatory financial services compliance, regulatory and policy strategy, and emerging technology. And has that perspective from both her time at the CFTC as a staffer, which we'll ask her a little bit about, and in the private sector. So she was most recently at Citi, and she was a managing partner. So she was working and giving advice both internally and externally. So she was advising the board, she was advising senior executives, and she was also talking to regulators and policymakers. And now she's on the receiving end of that. So and she also has held numerous leadership positions in professional industry and academia. And she is a graduate of UCLA. We always like to have a little California in there. And George Washington University Law School. So without further ado, Caroline, can you come up and join us? Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I believe you've been in Rome for, is it minutes or hours now?
Possibly 6 hours.
All right. So we don't really, it doesn't matter what day it is or what time it is or what time zone. So as I mentioned in my intro, we often think of regulators in the United States as pretty domestic, and you, following your social media and knowing your itinerary to get you to be able to fit this into your busy schedule, have been on a little bit of an international mission. So can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that and what you've been up to?
Sure, of course. First, I'll just give my standard disclaimer, the views that I'm expressing today are my own views as a commissioner and do not represent those of the CFTC or of any other commissioner. And it's been great. It's been a whirlwind. I think I've been a commissioner now for about 6 months, and I've wasted no time in hitting the ground running and getting out there, which is, no surprise given my previous role. That was a global role as well. So it's been great to get out there and to meet with other regulators and to talk about their approaches, because truly these digital asset markets are from inception borderless. They're designed to be borderless, so it's the very epitome of a global market. And I think it's very important that we work together and we have global cooperation and coordination to make sure that we have the most efficient and most inclusive means of providing financial services consistently around the world. And that also helps us minimize systemic risk and to avoid any regulatory gaps or regulatory arbitrage.
So are you allowed to tell us where you've been?
Sure. So far, I have been to Singapore, to Seoul for Korea Blockchain Week, to Aspen for a Technology Policy Institute. I have been to Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Paris, Prague for Eurofee, meeting with all of the central bankers and finance ministers on the occasion of the Czech presidency for the European Council. I think I got that right.
Yep.
And then I have been in London, and now I am here, and then next week off to the IOSCO annual meeting. So that's the International Organization of Securities Commissions, where I'm pleased to be providing a regulatory workshop on crypto assets to all of the various regulators, the heads of the agencies that will be there, and also a OECD workshop as well. And I think it's important that we consider the potential benefits of digital assets to developing economies. And I know that's something that's dear to the mission of many in this room.
Yeah, absolutely. I do not know how you keep up with that, but hopefully you have some folks helping you keep track of where you are and what time zone you're
right
in. There. There he is. So I'm curious, again, maybe my impression is incorrect that, other commissioners have been that internationally focused, but how has the reception been? How have those conversations been? Can you share any insights without anything, you're not allowed to share yet?
Yeah, so I think what's been really refreshing for me in doing this international tour is how important it is to be providing that message of positive engagement and outreach to the rest of the world, that the United States is a leader not only in us, for example, having the deepest and most liquid capital markets, but also a leader in, I think, outreach and engagement and promoting international harmonization through organizations that are international standard setters like the Financial Stability Board, like IOSCO that I just mentioned, like the Basel Committee, and so on. And I think what's been really nice is when I meet with other jurisdictions and we really are building a relationship and we're building goodwill and we're exchanging learnings and our perspectives, it helps us to understand one another better. And it also isn't this vision of an American cowboy coming out and trampling over others, although I do have cowboy boots, which I was wearing in Memphis, actually, I think, last week.
When in Memphis, right?
Exactly.
When you're in Rome,
yeah.
you've got to do other things.
And so I think one of the things that's been, that I've heard from the other regulators and central banks that I've met with that they've appreciated is the questions that I'm asking and how curious I genuinely am to learn about their approaches and what their observations are. Because for me, why not take advantage of the experience that others have in this space? There are other jurisdictions that have had regulatory regimes in place for registration and regulation of digital assets and crypto assets for several years now. And they've engaged with the ecosystem, and they've come up with paths to registration, and they've identified risks, and they've identified ways to provide supervision that addresses those risks. And so I think it gives us a leg up, and it's these types of learnings that I'd like to take back with me and use that to inform my approach to the policymaking as the U.S. continues to work through our approach to digital assets. And so, the way that I've been doing things, particularly with my private sector background, is get all the information, learn as much as possible, and then come up with some pragmatic solutions. So that's my approach to being a policymaker.
Oh, that is a very refreshing approach. So how important do you think, we had earlier today, Andrej Kobarek, who's from the Czech Republic and an MEP, and we were talking to him, they're just at the end of 2 years of getting MiCA, the text finalized, and he felt like that was a really long time. And I pointed out that, sometimes Washington, D.C., 2 years is really fast. But the other thing we talked about was they have 27 different countries. We have states. Like, we're one country. Yeah, we have 50 states. But they have come up with this harmonized framework. So the two-part question. One is, how important do you think that is, and how challenging is that to try and do that in the United States? And the second part is, what are your views on trying to have an international, maybe that's just a bridge too far, but kind of trying to harmonize. Certainly the learnings from them, they've been working really hard. You're obviously in information gathering mode. You're going to take that back. But those two different pieces of harmonizing across the states and then harmonizing on a more international level, given the borderless nature of blockchain technology.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think, whenever it comes to talking about the U.S. regulatory framework, and I often have to explain it to other jurisdictions because it's very confusing. It just doesn't make sense to many other people.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Come on. Got 50 states.
Exactly.
We all do different things.
Yeah. And, not just our system of federalism, which we do have state regulation. We have, limited federal regulation in certain circumstances under the Constitution while preserving states' rights and so on. But, we've dealt with federalism for financial services for a long time. That's what we have with the dual banking system. That's what we have with consumer financial services. And so we know how to do this in the United States. There's a foundation, at least, that we can build upon if, again, we get everybody in a room and we kind of hash these things out. And I think that's really important to have that kind of constructive conversation. Of course, at the federal level, we have 7 federal financial regulators, at least. There may be more that I've missed, but I think it's 7. And so that also can have its own challenges. But the U.S. financial system and the financial regulators evolved a certain way for a reason. Each of these agencies has a specific mission, and they complement each other, and it's worked, and I think it will continue to work. So I think it's a unique system, and it's a different system just because of our heritage and our form of government, but I don't think it's any less effective necessarily than other jurisdictions, except it can be faster for other jurisdictions, even the EU with its 27 member states, to get things done sometimes because you have a more streamlined approach to passing legislation and parliamentary systems, for example. You have less regulators, certainly, and so it can just be much faster to stand up regulatory frameworks, and particularly in smaller countries like Singapore, for example, where the regulator in Singapore is the central bank, the prudential supervisor, and the market regulator all in one. So they talk to themselves when they're putting things together. I think once you have that foundation, there's a lot of people working very hard in Washington to work through some of these thorny issues and to sort out how to come up with a clear and holistic regulatory framework for digital assets. But on the international stage, I think about other times that the international community has come together to address risks, for example, in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, where there was global derivatives regulatory reform, and that's when the CFTC really took on expanded authorities and global jurisdiction. Then there's also dealing with the COVID crisis and the response to COVID, and again, having all of these different nations come together to address that. So we can do it, and we have those dedicated forums in the G20, the G7, the UN, the FSB, IOSCO, Basel Committee, and so on and so forth. And I think it's been very promising to see the number of papers that have been coming out at the international level. And so that's where I just think it's very important that the United States, notwithstanding the fact that we're still working through things at home, that we have that strong, unified voice in the international community, and that we are providing input into the international standards. And Treasury's led the way with their international framework for how they've been engaging in all these forums as well.
Yes, it's been great to see the executive order and all of the agencies working together, at least from the outside. It's coordinated, which, as you said, we have a lot of regulators. They all have to make sure they understand what their role is and how it all interoperates with others. So shifting gears a little bit more domestically, I'm curious. You've seen financial crisis. You've seen big, challenging issues in your both inside and outside of government. When you look at right now, I think a lot of the headlines, you see a lot of scams, you see hacks in the crypto industry. From your perspective and based on your years of experience in the financial markets, are these growing pains of a new industry? Are these red flags? What do you make of all of that?
Yeah. So one of the things that is unfortunate is that when there are areas of innovation and of growth, then you see fraudsters and scammers see, frankly, opportunity. They see blood in the water and they go for it. And I think that's just something that's very unfortunate. But we have to always be vigilant. There are going to be frauds and scams that follow where the money is. And there's a lot of, tremendous investment in developing these new technologies and in unlocking the potential of blockchain technology, of Web3. And so it's something, though, that we know how to deal with. Every time that we've had these new areas, we've had robust retail protection. We've had very strong use of our enforcement powers. And I think you see that being recognized in the different reports under the executive order that the agencies do need to continue to use their existing powers. And indeed, we've led the way in enforcement, going after the truly bad actors that are really just ripping people off. And because of this, I do think it's important that we try to provide that regulatory clarity sooner rather than later, so that way we can start to weed out some of these bad actors and people have the information that they need in order to know how to make good decisions about where they're putting their money.
Well, that is music to my ears, because that's the mantra that we're constantly putting out there is more clarity. We're happy to follow rules if they're rules, and we want to work together with the regulators and with the policymakers to craft those rules, because the technology isn't intuitive always to some of us non-engineers. But that's part of our job is being that bridge and trying to help, like, not only go from the being in-house and talking to engineers and understanding it, but also to be able to share that information with folks who are building the policies that are not meant to address what's happening in the world today in blockchain, but for many years to come, because we certainly don't want to have, outdated regulations by the time they actually come into force. So I'm curious, is that something, obviously you've been on both sides of these conversations, so are there experiences that you had in the private sector that you would give, any advice or have any thoughts on the best way to try and help policymakers and regulators? Because that's one of the things I left government because I thought there were too many people. There's a trust and knowledge gap, and to be able to have people who've been on both sides speak the same language. So I don't know if there are things that you have seen on either side that you would want to share your insights on that.
Yeah. So I think it is sometimes a language barrier, honestly, because it's almost like sometimes the private and the public sectors are talking past one another, and it does need to be translated, because I think at the end of the day, everybody wants the same thing. I mean, putting aside the scammers and the fraudsters, which unfortunately usually take up too much of the oxygen in the room, by and large, the companies that I engage with, and particularly when I was in the private sector, want to do the right thing. These are responsible actors. And by the way, it's not a very good use of your investment capital to be putting it all into something that's going to be illegal, or to be putting it into something where you're going to be prosecuted civilly and potentially criminally. That just doesn't make sense from an investment perspective. And so I do find that the responsible actors are looking for regulation, like you said, and looking for those clear rules of the road, so that way they can actually pursue projects that could be viable and not waste their time with something that's not going to be fit for purpose, or where that's just not going to be viable in that market, with the regulatory framework the way that it is. I think I can't give any advice to anybody, but I always think that proactive engagement with regulators is really important. And like you said, there's a trust and knowledge gap, and that's why outreach and education is particularly important. That's why I've been doing learning tours, because how am I supposed to regulate something if I don't understand what it is? The way I would do things when I was in the private sector and I was coming up with policies and procedures, I was trying to come up with a way to do regulatory implementation, is to go and learn what the processes are, learn what the tech is, get a demo, sit down, really understand how it works, and then be like, okay, well, these are the rules and regulations, and then this is the policy that we should come up with that's going to minimize, compliance risk, legal risk, operational risk, protect clients and things like that. So I've taken the same approach. I've been getting out there. I've been asking people to show me their use cases, show me how the tech works, show me the risks that they see, show me the potential opportunities. So that way I can also be looking around corners, because I think regulators need to be forward-looking. We need to future-proof our regulations, because it's very inefficient to be constantly looking backwards and having to update our rules that were built for the last crisis. We should build them to be durable and flexible.
Absolutely.
To anticipate future issues, and that's why I think a principles-based regulatory framework is the best approach, and actually why I also came up with my 10 fundamentals for responsible digital asset markets, which again takes that principles-based approach and can be applied, to pretty much any asset class, and our core principles to how we deal with markets anyhow. And I've been pleased to see that all of the international initiatives have been consistent with my 10 fundamentals.
Yeah, I think CFTC is sort of known as being a principles-based, sort of a real model for how to lead with principles-based regulation. So I'm glad that you're carrying on that reputation. So I wanted to ask you about having industry come in and talk to regulators is obviously, like, we hear that all the time. There's some industry folks are tentative about that, and I'm sure you've been talking to folks who have overcome that. But do you have thoughts and ideas about how do we lower the temperature and actually make sure and facilitate that those conversations are happening without the concerns that some of the industry folks have?
Yeah, I've heard that from many market participants, and I think it is unfortunately the current environment. I mean, we are kind of in a gotcha type of environment, and I think that is not the best way. It's not a proactive, positive engagement kind of way to deal with things. So one of the things I've been doing and going and talking to other jurisdictions is to learn how do they engage with the crypto sector, and what are their best practices, or what have they found. And so I've discovered that for them, they have these true regulatory sandboxes where it's not like people get a free pass around something risky, but they come in and they sit down and they really talk with the regulator about the products that they're designing, and they identify the regulatory issues, and then there's actually almost a more close supervision or like a heightened monitoring that these regulators then have with those market participants to sort of iterate along the way and to get sort of that real-time feedback about the product features or about the target markets and how it works. And that allows the regulator to be constantly adjusting its approach, at least until you reach sort of the end of the sandbox, the end of the pilot, and then you've got a path to full registration and under the framework. And so that's something that's been intriguing to me. You know, we've had different initiatives in the United States, but I don't think any of them has been a true regulatory sandbox like what I just described. So one of the things I'd like to do is to come up with a design for how we could, under our U.S. laws and regulations and the frameworks and the constraints that we have, come up with a true regulatory sandbox that would allow for that. And in the meantime, you know, as people talk so much about retail participation in digital assets, I've also proposed an office of the retail advocate, which could be, again, that sort of proactive forum or channel for people to come in and talk to the CFTC, for that to really be a voice for the people, for it to be looking out for the interests of retail participants. And I think that's just another constructive way. There's other agencies, the Small Business Administration, the SEC, that have these types of advocacy offices, and I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, well, I love the sandbox idea, and I am curious. I think you're right that there aren't really sandboxes in the U.S. So I know that you're on your international tour and you're learning about how other jurisdictions have accomplished that. Have you had an opportunity yet to share some of those thoughts inside the U.S.? And again, I know you have restrictions on what you can say, but Jen, at a high level, have you gotten any feedback, and can you share any insights into how that is being received?
I think it's too preliminary at this point in time, but stay tuned for more.
All right. Well, we like that you're a trailblazer, because I think that those are the types of things that really make a big difference, right? Particularly, as you pointed out, right now, this gotcha environment that we're in makes it really difficult. And there are many different regulators, and everyone has different offices and different ways to engage. And so I applaud you. And if there's anything we can do to help move that along or be guinea pigs, we're happy to work on that. So you mentioned your principles, and you mentioned applying those to different digital assets. I can't have you here without raising the question that everybody asks, and I know you can't give an answer to this, but which is security, commodity, something else. So if you had the answer, you would have probably a different job, and we would know. But what are your thoughts on that in terms of how do we? This question has been being asked for years now. How do we push through it? How do we work together, public and private, to get so we're not asking that question anymore?
Yeah, so I have the quick answer, which is that pretty much everything is a commodity under the Commodity Exchange Act, except for onions. And movie box office receipts. Even securities are commodities, although that can be confusing. But I understand what you're saying. So, what I've been saying about this, since the beginning, is that the SEC, of course, regulates securities. But if it's not a security, then it's something that the CFTC has probably regulatory touch points over. And, people have talked a lot about our anti-fraud and anti-manipulation authority over the spot markets. And then there are two areas where we have direct oversight and regulation of spot markets in retail FX and retail leveraged commodity transactions. I think those are two areas where, again, we can learn. We can look at the lessons learned from that and see what could be applicable in the digital asset space as we work through what jurisdiction would look like there. I think, and this was recognized in some of the reports, again, that have just recently been issued under the President's executive order. The regulators do have very broad authorities and broad powers and ability to provide interpretations of our regulations. And, Congress has delegated that to us. And so, I think meanwhile Congress is working through a very thoughtful and clear and holistic approach to digital assets. It's incumbent upon regulators to try to do what we can. And again, that's one of the recommendations in these reports, is that we should do what we can to provide guidance, or to come up with new rules, as necessary and as applicable. So I think we should continue to be doing the hard work. We need to be rolling up our sleeves and working on that. Meanwhile, there is, again, that initiative by Congress to create that holistic framework. Congress makes the laws and I execute them. So.
Absolutely. Hopefully they talk to you a little bit before they throw them over the wall to you. So now I want to shift a little bit to, I'm very curious, you were at the CFTC as a staffer, and how long was that stint?
Oh, it was on and off for about 5 years.
All right. So going back in this role, have you had any surprises? Has it just been like, oh, of course, I worked for the commissioners, now I am one, but have there been any surprises, exciting things, disappointments? It doesn't all have to be positive.
It is exciting because I think you wake up every day and you're thinking, oh, I am in this position of public trust and I'm a decision maker, and that's a really awe-inspiring kind of gift and privilege to be given, and it's something that I take very seriously. I think something that's been unfortunate is that there has been a loss of trust or of faith in government. And so one of the things I've been trying to do with my, open engagement with the public is that for people to feel like they're being heard and seen by their government, right? We're here to work for you. My job is to work for the American people, and that it's a government that is there for them, because I feel like that's been lost along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I'm out there on social media. That's why I'm having so many meetings. That's why I'm, asking all the questions and asking people to come in and talk to me about things. So I think it's just a different lens when you are a principal as opposed to being staff. But, I've been very fortunate in that I do know how the building works. I've been inside the building, and I've been very lucky that we have such dedicated staff at the CFTC, many of whom have been there for decades. And so there's a lot of people there that taught me and that I learned from when I started off as an intern, all those years ago. And it's been really comforting. It's like coming home, I think. It's really nice.
Yeah, well, that's great. I think, and I'm curious, sort of, what have you been surprised? I know you haven't been there that long, and you've been on the road a lot, but have you been surprised by any sort of new perspectives because you've spent so much time in the private sector as well, kind of going back in and out? I think sometimes when you return, there's some eye-opening moments. So tell us a little bit about the benefits of having spent time in the private sector before going back in this role.
I think one of the things that really struck me when I first went to the private sector, because I think there is a skepticism, and it's important to have a healthy skepticism, but a skepticism about what the industry is telling you. So I just remember maybe within my first 2 weeks being in the private sector working at a bank and thinking to myself, oh, they weren't kidding when they told us that, or they weren't exaggerating. That really is an issue. That really is how it works. And I don't think you can really understand the operational aspects of what it takes to run a business, the technology aspects, the amount of governance, risk, and controls, the amount of resources dedicated to compliance, and again, that people are trying to serve clients and customers and we return value to shareholders, and there's so many different stakeholders. That's what being a business is. It's not a very successful business if you're constantly breaking the law and ripping people off. Nobody will want to come and be your customer anymore.
Right.
So for me,
you might have a few regulators knocking down your door as well.
Exactly. You lose your license. And so for me, just that operational aspect. So now I know how things work to an excruciating level of detail. And so coming back in with that practical implementation experience, it makes me, I think, a better policymaker because, again, I'm taking that pragmatic approach. I'm getting all the information. I'm learning as much as I can, and then I'm coming with a pragmatic solution. So when I'm looking at a particular, rule proposal, I already know, oh, that doesn't work that way. That's not how those systems work. Those aren't the departments that do that. That's not where things should be. And so I just really want to provide that practical perspective and that practical lens. And I think it's great that we do have a commission with so many diverse backgrounds for many different aspects, but particularly with also like our careers. And so each of us provides an important viewpoint, and I think that's been very gratifying.
Yes, well, I applaud you for bringing that perspective and going back and forth, because, as I said, that was my whole motivation for leaving the government and ending up at the foundation, because there really is, there's no substitute for really having a conversation on two sides where people really are speaking the same language and you really understand what it means. So we're very fortunate to have you there, and looking out for the digital asset community. And I will not speak for you, but it sounds like your door is open if folks want to come continue your educational journey. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, please reach out to my office. And like I said, I'm always interested in understanding what the possibilities of the technology are and where people are really using it. There's a lot of great ideas out there, but I'm particularly interested in the ones that might be coming to market in the nearer term, so that way we can make sure that there's the appropriate regulations and safeguards in place. And in particular, I think one area that the industry, as with many nascent industries, could focus on, and I think that's been shown by the recent crypto winter, is on risk and compliance. So having truly robust enterprise-grade risk management, risk management that is of the type that financial institutions have, because like it or not, these are financial services that are being provided, and having the right resources and talent, in the compliance departments and in the risk departments, having audit programs. So I think there's a lot of just the nitty-gritty stuff that needs to be done, as well as all the exciting things with the tech and with the engineers in the front office.
Exactly. It's not all sexy in financial services, but we've got to get all those pieces done at the same time and at the same level. All right, well, that was too short amount of time. I have so many more questions for you, but we are out of time. But thank you so much.
Yeah, and just one last comment, actually, that I would love to make. So I know a lot of people have been focused on sort of, you as a regulator, what's your approach? Enforcement's been such a hot topic, and I can't really talk very much about enforcement matters, but I do think that something that guides me as a commissioner is that we really need to be focused on where the harm is, and we need to be going after the bad actors and the scammers and the fraudsters and the people that are boasting about breaking the laws. And so for me, a common sense approach is that you look at where the harm is, you look at the bad actors, and you go after them. It's not somebody's 16-year-old daughter who owns a single token, but it's after the people who are trying to, hurt others and, are lying, cheating, and stealing. And so that is, I think, a common sense approach to take towards these issues.
Absolutely, and thank you for adding that last point, because I do think that there is some, I come from a federal prosecutor background, and so I kind of understand a little bit more of the discretion that comes into play when you're making those choices about how to who you're going to go after. And I think if you don't have that perspective, sometimes it may not seem like there's a common sense approach behind all this. So thank you for adding that last point.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.